The content of this video, as well as the thoughts, views, and opinions expressed herein, belong to the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views of Brigham Young University or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Hi, I'm Dr. Leslie Hadfield from the History Department here at BYU. In this session today, we're going to be talking about how oral history contributes to family history and the impact of family stories. Many of you, when you think of family history, probably think about these sorts of records, like microfilm. You've got to find names for your family members so that you can take this information about them and family events to describe the person, to locate them in history, and then take their names to the temple, or piece this together, your family history. Others, when they think of family history, may think about learning about their ancestors, their characters, their stories, who they were, what were their trajectories in life, and what life experience shaped them in both their individual lives and the life of the family. Well, oral history can help us with both of these aspects of family history, learning what information we can about our ancestors as well as family stories. Oral history really involves a lot of different genres. As you can see here on this slide, I have a list of them here. There's memorized speech. This includes epic poems, songs, genealogies. Sometimes people call these sorts of things verbal art as well, these songs and poems. We also have linguistic devices that can preserve things from the past, like proverbs. We see wisdom being brought out in these phrases that can help us understand the past. Other types of oral history include group accounts. So these might be stories of origins of a certain group. They might be histories of certain peoples or individuals that are told over and over, even histories of families. We also can include reminiscences and eyewitness accounts in oral history. So these are things that people who witness these events themselves might tell as they are remembering, or it could be somebody sitting down and remembering an event that happened in their life, or an event that happened in the community or nation around them. And as these things are told years later, these become oral history. One of the things that some scholars have pointed out as defining characteristics of oral history is that these sorts of things get captured in the oral record and are passed down from generation to generation. So, for example, Jan van Sina, who I have here on the slide, his seminal book, Oral Tradition as History, he talks about how we can see these oral traditions become traditions as they are passed down from one generation to the next. So when we think about oral history as traditions, as preserving this oral history over time, that is a key characteristic. Another aspect of oral history that I have listed here on the slide is life history. Now, this can be when somebody sits down and narrates their life in one sitting, and it can also be something when somebody sits down and interviews someone else and they just say, "Tell me about your life." These sorts of oral histories take time. You can go back to this oral history or this life story multiple times, and so it can take hours and multiple sittings, but this is also a form of oral history. A lot of these are recorded in many different ways. They could be recorded on video, they could be recorded just on audio, or they can be captured in a way that people, again, they memorize them, memorized speech, and they pass them down over generations. Others point out that we need to be really careful in creating a sharp distinction between oral traditions and other oral histories. So there are a lot of different cultures in this world who use oral history or oral means of preserving their history. And some of them say we can't just make this sharp distinction between what is a tradition and what is our history as a people, that these things really get meshed together as we are reminiscing or as we are talking about our community. Then these oral traditions come in certain ways, and maybe it's not packaged neatly as to sit down and say, this is an oral tradition about our community, about our family. So we have to be aware of these things and be listening for them. And it's a great way that we can pass things down from generation to generation and take stock of our own history. There are a couple of examples I want to share about how this works in family history as well. We talked about vital information when I brought up the slide of the census. Here is an image from a study that was done among the Ghanaian Bamoba people. And what the study did is they used some DNA testing to check to see if the oral genealogies that people had passed down from generation to generation were accurate according to the DNA record. And what this study found is that actually oral genealogies are more accurate than they initially thought, especially when it came to identifying people who were not in their genealogy. On the slide here, you can see the chart that the authors of this study created to illustrate these different generations of the genealogy. And you can see in the literal level, the more recent generation in this genealogy, that people were pretty accurate there. And as they went back in the intended or the mythical genealogy, there were some things that got a little muddled, and often what happened was that people would be incorporated into this genealogy, even though maybe biologically they were not. But what the people were able to do with an over 90% accuracy is identify people who are not in that lineage. So this is an example of how oral history can help us find that vital information about our ancestors. Another example of how oral history can help us connect to our family's past and our ancestors' characteristics and where they came from, maybe what culture they had, is the way that songs have played a role in identifying the ancestors or origins of certain people who are descendants of enslaved Africans who were brought to the United States. You can see here on the slide that I've highlighted this film, a very moving film called The Language You Cry In. In this film, it charts the way that ethnomusicologists recorded songs that these descendants of enslaved Africans kept in the Gola communities, which are found mostly in South Carolina. These are descendants of enslaved Africans who kept their language and much of their cultural practices as they were able to come together as a community to preserve these things. So the song that was recorded in the 1930s and still sung in a family in the 1980s, they were able to identify where this song came from in Sierra Leone, to identify the exact family. There was somebody who remembered the song herself and whose grandmother, when teaching her this song, said, "You need to remember this song because someday our people will come back and that's how we will know they are our people." And so they connected these two families across the Atlantic Ocean. Again, this is a very moving film, and I encourage you to go and find it and watch it. There may not have been an exact descendant list that they could put the names on, but for sure there was a connection there between these two families, and they were able to find their roots and where they came from in a very powerful way. So how are our family stories or oral traditions, and how do they work with family history? We're going to move into talking about these family stories. So if we think about family stories, in the same way that scholars who look at oral traditions look at those oral traditions, there are certain characteristics that we can identify. And these things, once we identify them with our family stories, then that helps us understand our family stories and their impact. So we look at, in oral traditions, first, how these oral traditions are generated. So we can look at our family stories and how they are generated. Usually they come from reminiscences or eyewitness accounts. These are stories that people will tell over and over that come from an actual experience in the family. So they start that way, as somebody is remembering, as somebody is telling what they experienced or saw firsthand. Then these stories become packaged stories in a way. There are particular important elements that are always included in this story, or even if it changes, there are certain turns that these stories take, and there becomes a formula where these stories become, again, a story that's packaged and is transmitted over time. Important bits of information become an important part of the story, whether or not the story changes over time. And then, as this story is told again and again, there are certain aspects that become important about this story in the way it is told, where it is told, and also the meaning that it has. So you can see there on the slide, I talk about the group account and identity. And this really often happens with family stories. So these are stories that are told about a family or told about a family member that become important to the family. And as it's told, there is some way that family members identify with the family with the story. It becomes, with the next point is that the interpretation and the meaning, when the story is told, there are some lessons that are taken from this story. There are some characteristics that then people point out. So we can see that our grandfather or our aunt, she did these certain things, and this is the way that the family is. So maybe you've heard of your own stories, and you can identify with these sorts of interpretations that put meaning onto this story. And this then, sometimes these stories become what one scholar called institutionalized in the family, that these are things that embody the family history and embody the family characteristics. And even if, again, they change over time. And so these group accounts really do help shape the identity of the family. Now, the performance of these stories becomes just as important in the way that it gets passed down. Again, where it is told, when it is told, all of these things, as we think about them, we can see how then these stories create meaning for the family as well in when and where they are told, and not just the story in just what it conveys, but also the setting in which this story is told and how it brings people together that way. I want to share an example from my own family and how a family story can bring in all of these aspects and become a very important part of the family identity and the family characteristics and belonging. So the basic story of this family story is very dramatic, and it's captivating, which is one reason why we tell it a lot in my family. It is a story of one night in 1929, our family living on the family ranch in a cold night out. This is north of the Great Salt Lake, remote area. A rabid bobcat came to the family ranch, and it frightened everyone in the night, and then it also exacted damage on the livestock to the family ranch, and it even meant that they had to put down the family dog, Prince, who is one of the heroes of the story, and we'll talk more about that. So this story was generated as the family told it to each other after it happened. The siblings, the mother, as they retold it to other people in the community or other extended family members. And my grandfather, who was 5 years old at the time of the initial event, he ended up writing it down as a school assignment. This is how dramatic and important this story was in this family's life. Of course, he did this with the help of his mother and older brother. And as each one of these siblings went on, they got married, they had their own children, they continued to tell this story. And as a granddaughter of this family, I heard this story told many times at family reunions, at other family gatherings, and sometimes in smaller, spontaneous settings. So maybe we're just sitting around, hanging out at grandma's house on a Sunday evening, and somebody tells this story. There are other times when my sister invited our grandfather to go and tell the story at school. So this story really was an important story to our family and told many, many times. When it is told in the family, this story is often accompanied by great emotion and commentary about what this story means to the family, how they survived through tough times. You might have caught that I said the year 1929. This was the year of the Great Depression, and that hit that family out on this remote ranch hard. And in the same year, just months after this rabid bobcat came and terrorized the family, their dad passed away. And so this was really tough. The rabid bobcat, the dad passing away, the Great Depression, also that year some of their cattle got sick and died. And so this story really is told in a broader context and the meaning of that. A lot of the people who talk about this talk about how they survived. So I talked about how this became a group account, and it became part of the identity of the family, as there were attempts at institutionalizing this story. So you can see here on this slide the first page from my grandfather's written account, how he pieced this story together for a school assignment with the help of his older brother and mother. And so this is an attempt by him to write this down, keep this family story going, preserve it. And over the years, there have been disputes about this family story, disagreements about what happened in this story. So I'm going to show another written account, and what I think this embodies, you can see in that very first line, "You are about to hear another version of the Rabid Cat fantasy." This was written by my grandfather's older brother, Ronald, who took an important part in this story. And here he's giving his account, trying to say what he thought was the truth about this. And you can see some of the details there. He mentions Merle, who was an older sister of the family, the oldest sister, and she also wrote her own story. And this was for her grandchildren and children to have, but also because, again, of these disputes about the facts of the story. So we had these three different stories, and of course, when it was told, people were talking about different aspects of this story. One of the main disagreements I'll get to later was who had the authority to tell what. There were just a few things. Most of the disagreements, as I've shared it with my students, as we've looked at family stories in family history, the students have looked at how these disagreements really are about minor facts, things that, as my students said, siblings would disagree about, right? Why did Ronald and Merle go out in the night after they had been making this candy? Why did they go out in the night? And other things like that. So there are these small disagreements about these facts, but there are agreements and important elements of the story. And my grandfather, years later, said, "Okay, we need to stop fighting. Let's talk about what we can agree on." And so he created another document in the list of documents with this story, about the points of agreement in the story. And you can see even here, my grandfather calls it the Bobcat story. There's the Wildcat, so even different names for this story. So you can see some of the important elements of this story highlighted in his different points of agreement. You can see here, he talks about that there was a holiday. It was on Valentine's Day. So in the handwritten account, if you go back and you can read, My Uncle Ronald was remembering it was some holiday, couldn't remember exactly which one during the winter, but they can say that it was a holiday, it was in February, and this rabid bobcat came to attack and came near the rear porch of the house. And the next 2 points talk about how there were some of these brushes with this danger. They were making candy for Valentine's Day, and some of them even went outside to cool the candy, not knowing that the bobcat was out there. And then Ronald and Merle went outside as well, and also not knowing that there was this danger out there. And then when they came in, it's really important that they highlight that the door was not shut all the way, because when the dog and the bobcat, which is the next part of the story, dramatic part of this story is that the dog prince, the family dog, and the bobcat were chasing each other out there, and they hit the door and came tumbling into the house. And this is a very important part of the story. It was so scary to all of the people there, especially the younger children. And then point number 5, you can see there, and this is something that is in an element in each of these stories, is there's this joke about how the dog was more afraid of Mother than the bobcat, and so he knew he wasn't supposed to be in the house, so he went right back out. And because of that, he saved the family from having a rabid bobcat in their house, and who knows what would have happened if they would have stayed there. So everyone agrees, the last point on this slide, that the bobcat chased the dog, and the dog did not chase the cat because the cat was rabid and more ferocious. It was a really dark night. You can see these other points here. And they tried to shoot it. They only had the pistol. And at this point in the story, often people make sure to point out that their dad was away, sick in the hospital. And so the older brother, Gordon, who was also another hero of the family, tries to shoot at the bobcat. Doesn't work. It's hard to shoot. They don't want to kill the dog either. And there's some reference to written evidence from the mother's diary there that they can all draw on. And then they survived the night, and then they called another hero of the story, the neighbor Archie Toyne, who came over and with the older brothers went out, and they were able to track what the bobcat did during the night with the livestock, and then eventually they found the bobcat, who snarled at them, and they shot it in the mouth, and the bobcat died. Another important part of this story, again, like I said, the family dog Prince is a hero of the story. And because they contacted some officials, they discovered that they would probably have to put the dog down, even though he saved them and he was so loyal. So that's a sad ending to the stories, that they had to put down the dog. And they also, later, as some of the cattle became mad or deranged, they had to also destroy some of the cattle. So you can see some of the important elements here of this story, that again, they're told, these elements are there each time the story is told. And you can see also the meaning then. So I told you important parts of the story here, but the meaning comes in the discussion afterwards or the commentary afterwards. And it doesn't have to be as long as the story, but it is just as important as the telling of the story. So the meaning is, well, first of all, it's a scary and traumatic experience. And those sorts of stories really stand out in our mind. So this is a story that is going to be told many times because of that element. My cousin who's also a historian, he and I have talked about how the story embodies the family's history of that year, as I pointed out earlier. So my grandfather, in his written story, he follows up with how his mother's journal entries later in the year mention how sad they were when their dad passed away. And this maybe was so difficult for the family to focus on that the trials of that year actually could be embodied more in this dramatic story that they could tell of the bobcat. And it's also a symbol of how tough life was at that time. So again, the story is often followed up with these other difficult things, But what it also is followed up with is how they survived. And this is an important message of the story that was passed down to us as the second, third, fourth generation, is that they survived. It was tough, but they survived. And we even had a family reunion many years later when I was younger, and we made t-shirts. And on the t-shirt were the words Grouse Creek Survivor. So that became an important message of this family story. Now, what I want to do next is share my nephew's version of this story. When he was 3 years old, he had taken in this story, and he was very good at telling this story. So I'm going to play this short video, and you can see how this 3-year-old of the fourth generation now understood and told this story.
Once on a time, there was a bobcat and a bobcat. And then are you born in you? That's sugar. And then it's sugar and tiny rockets. And the walk is hard. And the bobcat
Okay, so this is, besides being one of the cutest stories I've heard a 3-year-old tell, is a great example of how these family stories can be important in the family, so much so that this little child knew those important elements and could recount them. It shows the prominent place that it had in the family because of that. And it shows how the stories can be interpreted by our family members in their different ages, different ways. So here we have animals are very interesting to children. A lot of children's books use animals. And so he's focused there on the animal, the bobcat. And the bobcat is the villain of the story. It's the center. It causes all this fright with the family. And so he's focusing on that part. And then he also focuses on how they get the bobcat, and he puts himself in the story as well as he's thinking about that. You can see that that's an important element too. And it's very dramatic. And at the end there, he shows how the little rockets, which were not part of the original story. They didn't have rockets, but that's how he understood it, and how they were able to kill the danger to the family. So this idea of surviving this dramatic and scary event comes through. Now, as my nephew has gotten older, we've told the story at different times, and my dad, when he's read my grandpa's version of the story, then has talked about the meaning. And so now if we talk to my nephew, who's around 12 years old, then maybe he would have a different ending to the story. At this point, I invite you to pause and identify your own family stories that are told often or that are important to your family, and think about how they operate in your family. Take some time to identify 2 to 3 perhaps, and write about how they operate in your family. When and where are they told? Have they been written down? And what interpretation or meaning is applied? And they don't have to be like my family story where there are 3 or 4 different written versions. It could be something that's never been written down. But take some time to think about that and how they operate in your family. Okay, in the last part of this session, I want to focus on one particularly relevant aspect of family stories and how we can intentionally incorporate family stories into our family culture. Studies conducted in the past couple of decades have affirmed that knowing family history is correlated with greater resiliency in children and youth and positive identity development for adolescents. So I have some articles listed here that are a sample of these articles and these studies that have been done in the past few years. And I also want to thank Joe Everett from the BYU Provo Library, who helped me update my list here and pointed me to some new studies. When we talk about resilience in children, we talk about the ability to adapt to recover from difficult life experiences. And the American Psychological Association adds that this ability to adapt is especially through mental, emotional, and behavioral flexibility and adjustment to external and internal demands. So mental or psychological well-being, being resilient, is not defined as just being happy all the time and never being discouraged, but being able to cope with challenges and difficulties, to adapt, to figure out how you're going to deal with this challenge. As children become adults, they are learning how to be resilient. They take on these skills of learning how to adapt and cope, and those are really important to being healthy adults. They also are gaining more autonomy as adolescents and a sense of self, and yet they also need to feel belonging at the same time. Scholars assert that adolescents become healthy adults when they develop a combination of high autonomy and high relatedness. So those two things might seem like they are contradictory, but they're both important: high autonomy and high relatedness. So how can knowing our family history help build resilience in children and help them suffer less from anxiety and depression and help them build this positive identity? Well, it's important, first of all, to note that there is not a simple causation between knowing your family history and family stories and resiliency or positive identity, but there is a correlation. So that means that there could be other things happening in the family systems and family culture that mean that these family stories are part of some other good things that families are doing. But it is important to see what family stories and knowing family history can help us within our families. So one of the first things that scholars point out, and I think is easy for us to see, is that it simply expands the collection of stories that can inspire. This is the way that Fischel put it in her article. So for children, it can help us or help them see what's possible in their lives. It can help them see how people overcome adversity as they hear these stories from the past. How do you survive a rabid bobcat coming into your house? How do you survive the death of a family member? These are things that we can see, that children can see in these family stories. They can also develop a sense of agency as we see people making choices and responding to difficulties or responding to life choices that they have. And that's another example of how family stories can expand the collection of stories that can inspire. And that is helping us as children develop our own interests or decide what life paths to take. So in this BYU study, Brian Hill, a BYU professor, who was one of the authors of a study done in Australia, he said that there was quote, a kid who found out about his grandfather who had been a marketer and came up with a famous advertising slogan for Cadbury chocolates. And it gave this young man a whole new direction in his life to realize that he had a family member who'd done this amazing thing, and he gained confidence that maybe he could do something important as well, end quote. And so this kid, as he called him, he ended up choosing to go into business, I believe. And so we can find interest as we hear these stories about our family members, and maybe we identify with them. And that's another aspect of these stories, that it's not just stories that can inspire. They are more powerful because we have a connection, a kin connection to these stories. And so we can see ourselves in these people. We might even explain some of our own characteristics through these stories. Narratives also help us make sense of the past and the present. We can explain current situations. Maybe the story of our grandmother makes us understand her and things that she did that, and when she was raising her children, that then have been passed on to us. So it helps us understand current situations, current characteristics. It can help us deal with difficult experiences. So it's a way that we can understand trauma and keep it in instead of keeping it inside. Narrating trauma or traumatic experiences, scholars have studied the way that doing that can help us externalize this. So we don't keep it inside. We put it out there. We create a narrative that has an ending and meaning, and it helps us to process those difficult things. So emotionally processing these stories with children can help them gain the skills to emotionally process other difficult things that come into our lives. And so that's a way that it can help them reduce anxiety or depression and become resilient. It also, telling these family stories or learning our family history, builds connection to family. In other words, it provides a sense of identity with previous generations, what some people call our intergenerational self. As children and youth see themselves as part of something bigger, as something that's gone on, then they can see their identity reaching back into the generations and even into the future. And this can be developed even in the nature of the telling of the story. So at family reunions, sitting around the dinner table, those sorts of things, it's a family event. And so that also creates a shared experience and thus creates belonging. Those children feel like they belong. And if it's especially told during family time, specific family time, and everybody's called to hear this story, that can help create belonging. And it can also be fun. These stories don't have to be about always difficult experiences. They can be funny experiences, and it can be fun to sit around and tell these stories. So all of those things create that connection to family. And with that, like I said, it provides a sense of identity. And that sense of identity then instills confidence in children and also grounds them. And so that can help them be more resilient that way. And finally, it's a way to instill core values of the family and teach life lessons to children. So there could be a story about a mistake that someone made. And we then, from that story, we know we don't make those kind of mistakes. Or it can be a story about how somebody persevered, how they found their life path through many different trials or different experiments. So all of these things can help us teach values and life lessons to children. Family stories really can be transmitted in many ways in many settings. And scholars point out that we can run the risk of actually putting some pressure on children and youth to be a certain way or to fit certain values, fit into the family in a particular way, impose our own ideas on children. And so it's important that we don't do that. So on that very last important point on the slide that I talked about, scholars advise that a warm and respectful environment is key to bringing out the positive impact of family stories. So you've got to have that environment. Here, we're sitting together, we respect each other. And part of that, too, is that if parents ask children to elaborate and reflect and share their reflections about these stories, then that gives them the opportunity to process the story. It helps children learn how to process stories and emotions, and then their experiences later on as they grow older. And it also helps them autonomously connect. Again, remember back to that positive identity for adolescents. If they both build autonomy but also relatedness, those two important things, they can do that as they are given a chance to reflect on these stories. And Fuvush, Robin, Boenig, and Zaman wrote in their article that I've highlighted that they viewed, quote, family co-constructed narratives as a critical context in which parents help adolescents to structure their experiences in ways that allow for emotional expression and regulation, end quote. So think about my nephew's narration of that story. He had a chance to narrate the story. So it's a co-narration in a way. He gets to participate in telling the story, and that then gives him some autonomy in connection and relatedness. So how can we do this in our own families? What can we do with our own children and youth and with the oral history that we have in our families to contribute to resilience in children or other family members? So first of all, we can create opportunities. And as I mentioned before, family stories can be told in many different settings where people can sit around, and it's important that we create these opportunities where we can sit and listen without distraction. A lot of these articles point out the importance of family dinners, that this is a time we sit around, maybe tell a story from the family history and have a discussion about it. It's informal, it doesn't have to be formal. Vacations, family vacations are good times to do this. Bedtime, other holidays or family rituals. Maybe there's a family birthday and you want to sit people down just for a few minutes. Let's talk about our grandmother whose birthday is today, and we'll tell a story from her life. So there, we can create these opportunities. We can also take opportunities as they arise. So if we know stories ahead of time and something's come up in our child's life, or maybe we're just cooking in the kitchen and something comes up, then we can share these stories. And if we refer to them and return to them often, then these stories become part of the repertoire of our children and youth. It's like reading the scriptures regularly. That's how we remember them. And again, if we have discussions about them in these informal and formal settings, what do you think about this? Or remember that story. You don't even have to retell the story. You can even just have a discussion with your child one-on-one. Remember that story about grandfather doing this? I was thinking about that, and draw out an aspect or ask them, what do you think about that after you haven't heard that for a while and you've had this experience? What do you think about this story? Or you can talk about what characteristics they identify in their family members and how they might then take on those characteristics to help them in their life. There are many ways we can take these opportunities, refer to these stories often. Now, our children have different stages in life, and it's important that we gear those stories to what age they are and what they're experiencing in their own life. So we can start with children, and we can start with stories that are about them or that involve them or that they can relate to at their age. So, for example, as I mentioned earlier, and Fischel points out in her article, that kids like animals and animal stories. So the bobcat story is really important or really engaging to kids because it involves this bobcat. My father also told us stories often at bedtime about when he was our age. And there are 3 stories that we would often hear, and we even now ask him to retell those stories. So when he was walking home from school, when he was in kindergarten or first grade, and he was walking across the river, the ice broke and he fell in the river. It wasn't too deep, but as he continued the walk home, his pants froze. So this is just a story about something that he did when he was young and our age. Different things that had to do with some danger and how he survived, or just some fun things that he did with his friends. You can also tell painful stories. And it's important that we don't shy away from telling these stories because they are important to our family's history and to showing, again, our children that they can overcome. So don't keep secrets. But again, you want this to be age appropriate, and you also want to include processing with this. How can we show how to cope when you deal with these certain experiences or find hope in them? So present stories in ways that highlight values or the roles that different people have played, relationships that were important. The bobcat story in my family is scary, but there's a message to it, and they survived and how they survived. And you can go through all of those things. They went and called on the neighbor who they could count on. They worked together and moved through this experience. I also want to share an example from Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, who is an African-American scholar who has looked at how we can talk about race with our children. And she shares a time that she was in the grocery store with her 4-year-old son, and her 4-year-old son asked her, again, these are things that can come up spontaneously, asked her how their family got to America from Africa. He knew that they were from Africa, but he wanted to know why they were. And Dr. Tatum, in this experience, she knew that she couldn't lie to her child. She knew at one point slavery was going to come up, as that is how their ancestors were brought to the United States as enslaved Africans. And so she knew she had to be honest with her child, but put it in a way that was age appropriate and in a way that he could then process and become someone who could live healthily in the society. So she talks about how she explained how people wanted workers in the Americas, and so but they didn't want to pay workers, and so they took people from Africa. And she said, quote, "Even as I told this story, I was aware of 3 things. 1, I didn't want to frighten this 4-year-old, who might worry that these things would happen to him," which she points out was a characteristic of 4-year-old thinking. 2, I wanted him to know that his African ancestors were not just passive victims, but had found ways to resist their victimization. And 3, I did not want him to think that all white people were bad. It is possible to have white allies, end quote. So she went on to explain to her son how some of these people had responded to being enslaved, and also how eventually both people who were enslaved or the ancestors of those people and other white people got together and they worked together to end slavery. And then she could also reassure him that this would not happen to him. And so I thought that was a good example of how we can deal with these difficult family stories and the past and help our children in age-appropriate ways to deal with these so that they can then eventually be more resilient. It's also important, and the next point that I have there on the slide, is that we gather different perspectives and we share those perspectives, including the perspectives of our children and youth, as I mentioned before. So that's a way to show that there are different ways of experiencing an event and to respect different views. And finally, we need to, as I've mentioned before, give children an opportunity to reflect on the stories and share their own takeaways and lessons. What does it mean to them? And make sure that as you do this, you listen and validate their own feelings and perspectives. One thing that scholars have noted as they have done these studies is that many times mothers are the ones who share most of these stories, but fathers also play an important role, and it's important that both mothers and fathers share their stories and create these opportunities for their children to hear from both fathers and mothers, and really any family member can do this. I have benefited lately from having more time with my grandparents as they've become older and spent more time at home. I've been able to sit around with them, and stories come out that I haven't heard before. You can hear stories from your aunts and uncles and cousins, other family members, so we can all do this. Finally, I want to share one very important resource that I recommend that you look to, and that is StoryCorps. Maybe you've heard of StoryCorps. Often they share stories on the radio. And this is a project that goes around the United States and collects stories of people. They give people a chance to sit down in a booth and interview each other. So here on the slide, you can see I have the StoryCorps internet, the URL, and the web page there, and all of the different resources that are there. And what I've highlighted here is the tips for a great conversation that they have. Once you dive in, you can search for tips for a great conversation on their website. And you can see it gives you, if you want to do this just at home with your family, gives you some tips how to do that. And right there on that number 1, plan your interview. They also have a link there for great questions. So these are questions that they have found have worked really well to bring out family stories. So I hope that you will use these resources and use your family stories, get to know them, and discuss them with your children and youth, and find the benefits of knowing your family history.